Hello and welcome to Encore. Coming up on today's show. An unflinching tale told by the activists and leaders on the front lines of a battle, not just for civil rights, but the right to live. Whose Streets takes us behind the Ferguson, Missouri uprising and into the protesters' homes. Long-standing racial tensions in the community were pushed to the brink when Michael Brown was killed by police on August 9th of 2014, turning some of its members into the torchbearers of a new resistance. Filmmaker Sabaah Folayan shares a story she's lived here with us on Encore. Sabaah, thank you very much for joining us on Encore. I had the great pleasure of watching your film Whose Streets yesterday, a remarkable piece of work. It's dedicated to Michael Brown. His death sparked what you've called a new generation of freedom fighters. You went out there with a camera. What was it like for you behind the lens?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. In that moment, you know, I wasn't really thinking. It just felt like this was something historical and it was something that I had to be a part of. For Black people in the United States, there's this long legacy of fighting for equality and fighting against racism, and this seemed like the new iteration of that. So my friend, my fellow classmate, Lucas Alvarado Ferrar, was a photographer, and I was a pre-med student, and I actually wanted to go and try to do a public health study to show that people in police facing off was going to cause trauma. And ultimately, it was just too chaotic to do that kind of research, and we started asking questions and filming, and it developed organically into a documentary.
And how did it feel for you to be right there in amongst it all? To be an observer, but really right there on the front lines with everybody else?
I mean, it was really honestly terrifying because at a certain point I realized that there was no one to protect me. The police who, you know, ideally you would be able to call when you're in danger were the source of danger. And so it's a very existential moment. It's a very scary moment. And looking into the eyes of those officers, I saw some who were interested in de-escalating and communicating, but I saw far more who seemed like almost that they were relishing what they were doing and that they were relishing the opportunity to use these huge weapons, these huge guns, this incredible armor against people who had nothing more than signs and posters and their own voices. So it was really, really scary, and it was a moment that I felt like I had to make serious choices about what was important to me. And I knew every day that in a way I was putting my life at stake, and all of the people who were part of this protest were putting their life at stake for something that they believed in. And I would say that it changed my life. It changed the way that I live.
Let's take a look now at a few snapshots of Whose Streets.
Anybody growing up here, you tangibly know when you cross the county line, you got to drive a little differently. Your behavior changes because you know how policing changes.
Ferguson police just killed a man in front of my apartment.
People flooded in the area have some experience with police.
Things have never been right for Black folks in America.
We're trying to mourn, and you came here with 300 cop cars, riot gear, and canine units.
You gonna shoot me too?
But that ain't the story that you hear about.
Now, Martin Luther King said that a riot is the language of the unheard. That's referenced in this film. In 1968, he asked the question, what is it that America has failed to hear? How would you answer that question today? And given that next April will be 50 years since his death.
I think that America has failed to hear the message that until there is a massive, comprehensive effort at justice, at wealth redistribution, at acknowledgement of the atrocities that really founded our country, we will continue to have friction. There will always be these social issues because a huge segment of the population is at a deficit. We're not starting from a level playing field. Poverty is basically an enforced situation. People are living in ghettos in the most literal sense of the term. People are trapped. Children are being funneled into prisons. The consequences of slavery and racism and Jim Crow multiply as time goes on. They don't disappear just because you remove those laws when there aren't any proactive efforts at justice and at compensation. And I think people would like for us to just move on, just forget about it, just stop talking about it, and they don't realize that that's impossible. So I think that's the main thing that they're failing to understand.
In this film, there was a really powerful analogy that really struck with me. It's used to describe what you're talking about, progress or a lack of on the civil rights front. You talk about there's a knife that's been stabbed into one's back, pulling it out a few inches, still inflicts pain, needs to be taken all the way out to heal. What do you think is needed for healing to begin? Are we even there yet? Do you see it happening in your lifetime?
Honestly, I don't know if I see it happening in my lifetime. And as much as I will continue to fight for every piece of progress that I can have in my lifetime, I think this is about children. I think it's about the future, because there's so much work to do. I think that we need massive psychological healing, social and emotional healing, I think primarily. And I think on both sides of the equation, racism has created a situation where mentally a lot of people end up losing touch with their humanity, and a lot of the problems and the violence that plays out, I think, is a result of that. And then I think we also need serious financial, again, redistribution. It has to be acknowledged that it would take, I can't remember the exact number, but it's something like 200 years for the average black family to catch up in wealth to the average white family. So that means that it's mathematically impossible for us to achieve equality without some kind of intervention.
Maya Angelou said that history, despite its retching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Another reference from your film. We also hear from protesters, we have nothing to lose but our chains. That's repeated time and time again. How do the past and present intersect here?
It's cyclical. It almost feels like we are reliving history with new sort of trappings, new technology, new language, but the same types of situations. And so when we look back to authors like Maya Angelou, like Dr. King, like Du Bois, like Fanon, we see that the situation that we find ourselves in has already been analyzed in certain ways. And we also tried to add in the film, we use Twitter and social media to convey new information because there are different aspects of this struggle that our generation has adapted to. But
and how has social media contributed to sharing the story, to raising awareness, to keeping the community connected?
Social media is critical. In St. Louis, this group of people, this community of protesters was very much outnumbered locally. And I think that having that solidarity from around the world really served to reinforce the movement. There were also very tangible sharing of strategy and information about how to survive tear gas, how to make a gas mask out of household items that were very useful, and just letting people know what's going on and making people realize that their struggles are connected. As I've been in France, I've been in Oslo, I've been in South Africa, I've been in England, and everywhere I go, someone tells me that they have lived through this same type of struggle. So opening our minds to the fact that it's a global situation, I think, is a really important function of the internet.
We see young black people turn their fear into fury and activism. The National Guard was called into Ferguson with military-grade weapons. What did you make of that? You were there.
I think that particular moment should be the moment that wakes up anyone, even if you're not able to understand and empathize with the struggle against racism. You should be able to realize that when your government has weapons to that level and they're using them to suppress speech, that is a threat to democracy as a whole. And the use of force was way overbearing, extremely overpowering, very unnecessary. It's well documented that in these situations when there are protests, it is in fact the police who are the ones to escalate the violence. It's something that we saw, and it's something that was documented in the 1960s. And this is a perfect example of how this hyper-militarization and this extreme use of force really serves to disrupt and compromise democracy.
How did you feel about some of the looting and the rioting that went on with the protesters?
I think it goes without saying that we don't want to see anyone hurt. We're fighting for life at the end of the day. But I think it also has to be noted that this kind of property damage that you see is kind of a human knee-jerk reaction. So while we can sit and, theorize about it, that would be to start in the middle of the problem. We need to start at the beginning of the problem and ask, why are people there in the first place, and how can we avoid it? Because once we've gotten to that point, it means that so many things have already gone wrong that this kind of instinctual response just happens. And you see it happen at sports games, and you see it happen all throughout history. So I try to avoid, judging and condemning that particular moment, because I think it just isolates one tiny part of the issue.
Well, now let's move on to your cultural pick, Sabaah, of the moment. We asked you to choose, and you picked your co-director Damon Davis's exhibition. It's coming up in St. Louis in April, and it's called Darker Gods in the Garden of Low-Hanging Heavens. So tell us, why is that one to catch?
It's really important because Damon has an incredible ability to translate very complex emotions into images and sounds. It's going to be a full sensory experience. The main theme behind the exhibition is that for so many of us as Black people, we're either seen as subhuman or superhuman. We're never necessarily seen as just average. And so he takes that idea and turns it on its head, creating these stories about these Black people as deities in an alternate universe. And so it's just a really beautiful exploration and celebration of humanity and, fantasy and futurism. It'll be a really great experience.
Sounds interesting. So if you're in St. Louis, definitely an exhibition to catch. Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thanks for joining us,
Thank you so much.
Your film is definitely one to watch. Whose Streets actually hit the big screen here in France at the Paris Hip Hop Winter Festival. That's on until Sunday. Do check it out. Catch the film. We'll leave you with the sights and sounds of Paris hip hop.
Thank you.